Our reading this morning is from Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 through 7. If you want to follow along in the Pew Bible, it is in the Old Testament on page 49. From the wilderness of Sin, the whole congregation of the Israelites journeyed in stages, as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, "What shall I do for this people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord said to Moses, "Go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will be standing there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it, so that people may drink." Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. He called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and tested the Lord, saying, Is the Lord among us or not?"
Friends, will you pray with me? And as you feel so familiar and comfortable, I invite you to join in the second time through. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God. Amen. This is our second week that we have heard this text from Exodus. We're going to hang out with it for the month of July. It is part of our year-long sort of focus on water stories. We draw, for those of you who are visiting today, at Epiphany, we draw Star Words as a sort of guide for our year ahead. And this year I drew one for the church as a whole, and water was the word. And I was thinking about these folks here, this whole group. It said they were traveling in stages through the wilderness. They have been freed. Moses, with God's help, has freed the people of Israel from their enslavement under Pharaoh in Egypt, and they are journeying back to their homeland in stages. And multiple times in the text it says, the people. The people cried out, they were thirsty. Moses talks to God about these people as if they were this monolith. And I've been thinking about how we tend to do that with history. Even in the midst of the pandemic, I was thinking, how are they going to write about this in history books? How many times have you read through history books and they're like, oh yeah, the Spanish flu was from this year to this year, and on you go. And this many people died, and this many people were ill, and then this happened. And I thought, and here we are living through this giant thing, and they're going to say, okay, yes, the COVID-19 global pandemic occurred from the year 2020 to 2023 or 2024, however they decide to mark the end. And this many people died. And this is what happened. And on they went. And we sort of get this overarching, like there was a universal experience. And sometimes I think we overlook the individual stories and feelings and experiences with those events. So I was thinking about this people of Israel, thinking about them journeying through the wilderness. And I was thinking that about them and how they might have individually and as family units been actually experiencing this journey. This leaving of a place of oppression and enslavement to go back. But for many of them, they wouldn't have known this homeland to which they were returning. Right? There have been generations in Egypt under enslavement. They're going to a place that they were told about. It is something new and unknown. And they're hungry first, and God provides manna that they can eat each day, and then they can't save it, but each day they will be provided with manna, with food. But I'm thinking about the families, the children saying, I'm hungry. They're worried. And now they've camped out, they're in an encampment. I think sometimes we think of backyard camping. Have you ever seen images of refugee camps? Right? Acres of tents. People crowded in. Imagine this people spread out over this land, barren land. They've got their tents, they've got livestock along with them. There are children running here and there with their groups, playing games, probably, sometimes completely oblivious to the concerns of the adults. And the adults are worried. They're thirsty. The people cried out to the Lord. The people. What were their individual stories? I think it's important for us to remember that these were individuals. That this journey affected them deeply and personally. That they were worried, that they were scared, that they were angry, that they had been removed from this life. And yes, it was horrible and hard, and it was a place of death, but at least they knew it. They were angry that from their perception, they had been moved from that place just to go and die in some other place. They were sad. I wonder, in crying out for thirst, if they had already lost people. If there were elders, or the very young, or the sick, who had already succumbed to the heat, to the stress of the journey, to the lack of food before the manna came, to the lack of water. We aren't told that, but we can imagine that in this whole big group called the people, that there probably were families who were grieving. I think about that in the midst of our current situation in our country and in our world. I wonder how it will be written in the history books in the years, decades to come. Will they call us the people? The American people? Or even the people of Earth? And many of our troubles are global in scale. Will it be a blip? Will they forget that there are individuals? That there are families? People dealing with our decisions as a government and as a nation, and grieving. How many of you know the name Joanna Macy? Any of you heard of Joanna Macy? Joanna Macy has been working on systems and relationship theory for decades, starting in the 70s. She was trained in a Christian seminary and then decided it was too patriarchal and ditched it and became a Buddhist. But she works particularly with ecology and systems and and change. And now she has trained people to lead her work, and it's called The Work That Reconnects. And it's about being emotionally present and strengthening relationships to create and enact change in the world. Joanna this week entered hospice. So she will soon be leaving us to continue on her work. But this writer on Substack, Rebecca Hyman, was writing about Joanna Macy and her work. And she was talking about grief. This writer is a therapist, and so she deals with clients in their grief all the time. But she was writing about Joanna Macy's grief. And she summarized a little bit. She said that Joanna Macy sort of says that until you access your grief, your ability to act will likely be blocked. And she says the fear of grief, really of the pain and sadness and powerlessness that fuel it, makes it almost impossible to harness the energy necessary to resist the power structures that rationalize and enforce violence. Those words really resonated with me. In a week where I know many of my colleagues were just at a loss of what to preach this morning. How to preach good news in a week that has been full of news that is not good. And a morning after floods, terrible floods in Texas. We see a little bit more when we read those stories, that the people of Texas are not the people of Texas in this instance. They are grieving families and campmates and friends. They are mothers and fathers who are hoping against hope for the news that they know will probably not arrive. And there are folks, I hate to say, folks who generally vote the same way as me, who have been saying, what did you think was going to happen? Texas is getting what it deserves. Forgetting that Texas is not a monolith, that we are not a monolith, that these are individual people. Grieving, scared. These are communities who have been washed away. So much of our lives lately, I think, have been avoided grief. We take in as much as we can until it feels like too much. And then we put down the phone, we shut off the radio, and we walk away, or try to. But we don't let ourselves grieve. So much of the pandemic was just getting through, figuring out how long you were going to have to wait in line at Market Basket. Do you remember those days? When they only let a certain number of people in at once, and all had to stand outside. Figuring out how, as congregations, we could gather and not gather. Keep social distance from each other. Wear masks or not. So much was so focused on the details and the pragmatics. Very often when I do funerals and celebrations of life, I remark at that so often families who are in the midst of this grief are not actually free to grieve because they're dealing with paperwork and details and service organization and who's doing this and what are we doing and how do I have access to the bank account and what do I do? The book, if you haven't read Memorial Days by Geraldine Brooks, that came out fairly recently in the last year or so, she writes about this. Her husband, the writer Tony Horowitz, died suddenly. And she spent 3 years not grieving, just dealing with the pragmatics of losing the person who was the person who talked to the accountant and knew what to do with all the bank accounts and all the insurance and dealing with children and real estate and all kinds of stuff, until she finally had to leave and take herself on retreat to Australia and let herself live into that grief. So I think about these people in the wilderness of sin. These people journeying with Moses. And how we see them. We tell this story, they traveled and they called out to God, and they as a whole people. And whether they had time to grieve. To grieve for the generational trauma. They wouldn't have called it that, obviously, at that point. Or for the trauma of a people who were forced to leave their homeland and enter into slavery. For the grief of having to fight for their freedom. For the grief of that freedom now being a very, very tenuous existence and journey. For the spiritual grief of constantly questioning their God's intent for them and their people. So I just want to encourage you all to make space today or tomorrow, sometime this week, for grief. Maybe take one news story at a time. Don't try to grieve it all at once, because it's a lot. But just let yourself cry, weep, sob, rage at the injustice of it all. Feel despair for a little while. Because if we don't, we will be blocked from being able to make change, to feed the hungry, to offer water to the thirsty, and clothe the naked, and visit the prisoner, and all the other things that we were called by Jesus as faithful people to do. And whenever you read the stories in the Bible, or the stories on your news app, and anyone is described as the people or the group, try for a moment to imagine the individuals in that story. Their fears, their hopes, their dreams, and their grief. Because even by doing so, by holding space for them, even if we don't actually know their names, we are accompanying them in their grief. And we are lifting them up to God, remembering that God is present with them. And we are enabling ourselves to continue what Joanna Macy calls active hope.